The winter that changed Sarah Boone's life began the afternoon her wagon wheel cracked clean in half on a mountain road in Colorado, leaving her stranded 6 miles from the nearest town with nothing but a stubborn mule, a broken rifle, and the absolute certainty that she did not need a single soul on this earth to help her survive. It was October of 1878, and the Rocky Mountain air had already turned sharp as a blade, carrying with it the particular bite that warned any sensible person to seek shelter before the season made that choice for them. The aspens had dropped their golden leaves weeks ago, and the spruce trees stood dark and sentinel against a pewter sky that promised snow before nightfall. Sarah Boone stood beside her ruined wagon, hands on her hips, jaw set in that particular way her late mother had once called her mule face, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of a woman who had been solving her own problems since she was old enough to lift a hammer. She was 26 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept braided tight and practical, brown eyes that missed nothing, and a face that had been called handsome by those who meant it as a compliment and severe by those who did not. She was tall for a woman of her era, lean from years of work, with calloused hands and a straight spine that she had never permitted to bend, not once, not even during the worst years. The worst years had included the death of her father when she was 19, the subsequent discovery that he had gambled away most of their farm in Nebraska, the 2 seasons she had spent working for a laundress in Abilene to save enough money to buy her own plot, the fever that had taken her younger brother Thomas before she could get back to him, and most recently, the failure of the small homestead claim she had staked outside of Pueblo, Colorado, which the drought had turned to dust, and the bank had subsequently reclaimed when she could not make the final payment. She had packed everything she owned that was worth packing, climbed onto her wagon seat, and pointed herself north toward a cousin's claim near Denver who had once written her that there was good land to be had in the mountains if a person wasn't afraid of hard work. Sarah Boone was not afraid of hard work. She was afraid of very little if she was being honest about it, and she prided herself on that fact. But a cracked wagon wheel in the mountains in October with snow coming was a problem that her pride alone could not fix. She crouched down and examined the brake. The wheel had hit a rock hidden beneath a shallow, muddy puddle on the mountain road, and the force had split the wood right through the hub. She could see immediately that it was beyond her tools to repair on the road. She would need a wheelwright, or at minimum a forge and someone who knew how to use it. She had neither. She stood and looked at her mule, a gray animal she had named Congressman on account of his stubbornness and his talent for doing nothing when you most needed him to move. Congressman regarded her with the mild, distant expression he wore at all times, as though the troubles of the world were not his concern. "You are absolutely no help," she told him. She unhooked him from the wagon traces, tied him to a tree branch, and took stock of what she could carry. She could not carry her trunk. She could not carry the iron stove she had been hauling with her, nor the crates of dry goods she had intended to use to set up her new home. She could carry her saddlebag, her rifle, the small tin box that held her money and her brother Thomas's watch, and enough food for 2 days. She loaded all of this onto Congressman's back, since he at least had 4 working legs, and she began walking north, leading the mule by his rope, watching the sky. The snow started an hour later. It did not start gently. It came in the way Colorado mountain snow came, sudden and committed, the flakes large and thick, and already beginning to accumulate on the road with a soft hiss that was somehow more ominous than wind. The temperature dropped with the kind of speed that the mountains used to remind people of their smallness. Sarah walked faster, her coat already damp at the shoulders, her breath making short white clouds in front of her face. She had walked perhaps 2 miles when Congressman stopped entirely and refused to continue. She pulled on his rope. She spoke sharply to him. She walked around to face him and pushed at his chest with both hands, which moved him not at all. She considered briefly leaving him, but he had her saddlebag strapped to him, and she needed what was in it. And besides, She had bought that mule with 8 months of wages, and she was not about to surrender him to the Colorado wilderness. She was still arguing with Congressman when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road ahead of her, muffled by the snow, coming from the north. The rider emerged from the white curtain of falling snow like something from a story, a large man on a dark horse, moving at a steady pace that suggested he knew this road well and was not particularly alarmed by the weather. He wore a heavy canvas coat with a wool collar, and his dark hair was long enough to brush his shoulders beneath a wide-brimmed hat that was already white with collected snow. As he drew closer, she could see that he was big in the way that mountain men got big, not the soft roundness of a prosperous townsman, but the dense, hard-built mass of someone who spent his days doing work that required actual force. His shoulders filled the coat in a way that made the coat look like it had been made for a smaller man. His arms, when he reined the horse up and rested his forearm on the saddle horn, were thick with muscle, even through the heavy canvas. He had a square jaw covered with several days of dark beard, a straight nose, and dark eyes that assessed her and her situation with the calm efficiency of a man accustomed to making quick decisions in difficult terrain. He looked about 30, perhaps 32, and he had the kind of face that was not classically handsome, but was so immediately compelling that handsome seemed beside the point. He looked down at her from the horse, and then at Congressman, and then at the snow accumulating on her shoulders, and his expression was entirely neutral. "Wagon trouble," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "I am perfectly fine," Sarah said immediately, because this was what she always said first before she had even assessed whether it was true. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Your mule is refusing to walk and you are 2 miles from the nearest shelter with a storm coming in," he said. "That is a particular kind of perfectly fine." "I did not ask for your assessment of my situation," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not." He did not ride away. He sat there on his dark horse in the falling snow, looking at her without any apparent urgency, as though he had all the time in the world to wait for her to come to her senses. It was, she would later reflect, one of the most infuriating things she had ever encountered because she could not even accuse him of pressuring her. He was simply there. "I need to get to Denver," she said finally, mostly because the snow was now definitely accumulating in her hair and she needed to say something. "You will not get to Denver tonight," he said. "Or tomorrow. This storm will close the pass by morning. I have a cabin 3/4 of a mile up the western slope. You are welcome to shelter there until it passes." He paused. "My name is Levi Sawyer. I have been trapping and hunting this range for 8 years, and I mean you no harm." She looked at him. She was a woman who had learned to read people out of necessity, and what she read in Levi Sawyer was a man who was telling her the simple truth. There was no hungry calculation in his dark eyes, no false warmth designed to manipulate. He was stating facts and offering shelter the way you might hold open a door for someone walking behind you, because it was the obvious right thing to do and required no great deliberation. "I need no one to rescue me," she said, and she heard how childish it sounded even as she said it, and she hated herself slightly for saying it anyway. "All right," he said simply, "but the cabin is there if you want it." He reached down and took Congressman's rope from her hand in one smooth motion, and then he clicked to his horse and began moving at a walk, and Congressman, the absolute traitor, followed immediately without any protest at all. Sarah Boone stood in the snow for exactly 3 seconds, which was how long it took her to recognize that her options were hypothermia or swallowing her pride, and then she walked after them. The cabin was set back into the slope of the mountain in a shallow natural hollow that protected it from the worst of the wind, surrounded by dense spruce that made it invisible from the road. It was small but solid, built from heavy logs with tight chinking, a stone chimney with a thin thread of smoke already rising from it, and a lean-to attached to the eastern side that served as a stable. It was clean and purposeful, like its owner. Nothing was there that did not need to be there, but everything that needed to be there was. Levi put both horses and congressmen in the lean-to, gave them water and grain with the same quiet efficiency with which he appeared to do everything, and then he held the cabin door open for her without fanfare. She walked inside. The interior was warm from a banked fire, and it smelled of pine sap and wood smoke and something faintly like dried herbs. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, a heavy table with 2 chairs, a sleeping bunk built into the east wall, shelves stocked with provisions, a collection of trapping equipment hanging near the door, and on a small nail near the window, a watercolor painting of mountain wildflowers so surprisingly delicate and lovely that Sarah stopped and stared at it. "You painted that?" she asked. "Yes," he said, not looking at it, crouching to build up the fire from the banked coals. "You trap animals and paint flowers," she said. "A man can do more than one thing," he said. She set her saddlebag down and unbuttoned her damp coat and hung it on the peg he indicated near the door. She stood by the growing fire and let the warmth begin to work on her fingers, which had gone stiff with cold. "Sarah Boone," she said, because she owed him that much. He looked up at her from where he crouched by the fire and nodded once. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Boone." "Mrs.," she said, and then she corrected herself because she had not been Mrs. anything for 3 years and the habit had died hard. Miss Boone is correct." He did not ask about the brief Mrs. He simply turned back to the fire and fed it another log, and the flames built up into a proper warmth that began to fill the small cabin. That was the first night. She had assumed she would stay 1 night, perhaps 2, and then the storm would clear and she would be on her way. The storm had other plans. It snowed for 4 days without meaningful interruption, and when it finally stopped it left 3 feet of packed snow on the ground and drifts against the cabin wall that came up to the window sills. The pass north to Denver was emphatically closed. The road she had come from was equally impassable. Sarah Boone was, whether she liked it or not, wintering in Levi Sawyer's cabin. This fact settled over her like the snow itself, heavy and without apparent option, and she spent the better part of 2 days being furious about it, though she was careful to be furious in a contained and productive way, because being furious without being productive seemed to her the worst kind of waste. She organized his shelves, which were functional but not efficient. She inventoried his provisions and mentally calculated how long they would last and what they would need. She mended her own coat, and then, because she noticed a tear in one of his heavy wool shirts hanging near the door, she mended that too without asking his permission, because it needed mending, and she had the needle already threaded. Levi Sawyer, for his part, treated her presence in his cabin with a respect so complete and so undemonstrative that it took her several days to even recognize it as respect. He gave her the bunk. He arranged a sleeping area for himself near the fire without complaint. He did not explain or justify any of this, simply did it, as he appeared to do most things. He cooked in the evenings, and his cooking was better than she expected from a man who lived alone, straightforward and nourishing, elk stew with the dried herbs from the bunches she had noticed hanging from the ceiling, cornbread baked in a cast iron pan, dried apple slices sweetened with a careful measure of sugar because he rationed it and was honest about why when she asked. "Winter is long up here," he said. "Supplies have to last." "Then let me help plan them," she said. He slid the inventory ledger. He kept across the table to her without hesitation. She looked at his handwriting, which was careful and precise, and his calculations, which were correct, and she revised the rationing schedule to make their provisions stretch further and told him what she had changed and why. He read her revisions without expression, nodded once, and then said, "That is better than what I had," and accepted her changes without argument. She had never in her life had a man accept her judgment about anything practical without first arguing about it, or at least making the face that men made when a woman suggested she knew something they did not. Levi Sawyer simply looked at the facts, determined she was right, and said so. She found herself thinking about it later that evening while he sat across the table from her and read from one of the 3 books on his shelf, a thick, battered copy of Thoreau's Walden, by the light of an oil lamp that made his face look carved from something durable and warm. "What brought you to Colorado alone?" he asked, without looking up from the book. "The same thing that brings most people anywhere," she said. "I was looking for something better than what I had." He looked up at her then, and the lamplight caught his dark eyes and made them warmer. "Did you find it?" She thought about her failed homestead, the drought, the bank. "Not yet," she said. He went back to his book without offering her any hollow reassurances, which was also, she noted, unusual. He did not tell her she would find it. He did not tell her everything happened for a reason or that God had a plan. He simply accepted that she had not yet found what she was looking for and returned to Thoreau, and she sat across from him in the warm cabin while the wind drove snow against the window glass and felt, to her considerable surprise, more comfortable than she had in years. She knew she was in trouble the morning she woke up and felt genuinely happy to see him. It was maybe 3 weeks into the winter, and he had come in from his morning check of the traps, which he ran on snowshoes in the early hours, and he was covered in snow, and his breath was making great clouds in the cold air he'd let in with the door, and he had a brace of rabbits in one hand and a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. And he stamped the snow from his boots and set the rabbits on the table and said good morning to her. And she had felt something shift warm and certain in her chest and thought, with immediate alarm, that she was in very serious trouble indeed. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was the isolation, which was known to make people attached to whoever was nearest. She told herself it was the fact that he was, objectively, a very well-built man with an unexpectedly good mind and a quality of stillness that she found extraordinarily restful, and that these were observable facts about a person with whom she happened to be sharing a small space and nothing more. She did not wholly believe herself, but she committed to the performance of believing herself, because she was Sarah Boone, and she did not need anyone, least of all a mountain man in Colorado who was kind to her mule and painted watercolor flowers. The problem was that Levi Sawyer kept doing things that made her performance harder to maintain. He fixed her rifle. She had mentioned once in passing that the firing mechanism had been sticking, and 3 days later she found it on the table with the mechanism clean and properly aligned and a note in his careful handwriting that said only, "Replace the worn spring." He had not asked her about it. He had not made anything of it. He had simply noticed, obtained the necessary part from his supply stores where he kept spare components for exactly these purposes, and fixed it. He showed her the snowshoe route to the creek so she could fetch water on the days he was checking the far end of his trap line, and would not be back until afternoon, because he understood without her having to say it that she did not want to be idle and dependent in his cabin all day. He laid out the snowshoes and showed her how to fasten them on her boots with a brief and practical demonstration that involved absolutely no condescension about her ability to figure it out, which she did figure out in approximately 4 minutes, and then he showed her where the creek was, and where the ice was thickest and safest to step, and where there was a current that kept a section of it open, and he said, "You will want to know all this regardless," as though it were simply obvious that she would want to be capable. She stood in the winter silence of the spruce forest with the creek burbling dark against the snow-covered ice, and she thought that perhaps what she had been missing all her life was not help, which she had always refused, but this particular quality of being seen clearly by someone who then simply acted in response to what they saw without making a production of it. She thought that was a dangerous thing to think, and she thought it anyway. The day she twisted her ankle was a Tuesday in the 2nd week of November. She had gone out on the snowshoes to fetch water, and had come back up the slope misjudging a buried log beneath the snow's surface, and had gone down hard and felt the sharp wrench in her left ankle that told her immediately it was a sprain and a bad one. She had sat in the snow for a moment assessing the situation with the pragmatic calm she brought to all emergencies, and then she had gotten up and put her weight carefully on it and determined that she could walk, but it was going to be unpleasant, and she was going to pay for it later. She made it back to the cabin with the water. She set the bucket down and unbuckled the snowshoes and sat in the chair by the fire to get her boot off. And the ankle had already swollen enough that removing the boot was a significant exercise in not making any sound that could be interpreted as distress. She was partway through this exercise when Levi came in from splitting firewood, stamping snow from his boots, and he looked at her immediately with the same direct assessment she had come to associate with him. And he saw the boot half off in the angle at which she was holding her leg, and he crossed the room in 2 long strides and crouched down in front of her. "Let me," he said. "I have it," she said. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, quiet and certain and with just enough weight behind it to mean something, went through her like warm water. "Let me." She let him. He removed the boot with hands that were large and calloused and capable, and also, she noted with an irritation directed entirely at herself, somehow extraordinarily gentle. He peeled back her stocking with the same careful practicality, examined the swelling ankle, pressed 2 specific points to gauge the injury and looked up at her. "Not broken," he said, "but you need to stay off it for several days." "I need to fetch water tomorrow," she said. "I will fetch water tomorrow," he said, "and the day after." "That is your task," she said. "I do not want you doing things for me." He sat back on his heels and looked at her, and there was something in his dark eyes that was not quite amusement and was not quite exasperation but was somewhere in between those things and was entirely genuine. "You would do it for me," he said. She opened her mouth and closed it again, because he was absolutely right and they both knew it. If he had twisted his ankle, she would have fetched the water without a second thought, and she would have found his refusal to accept help irritating. She sat with this realization for a moment, which was as long as her honesty required her to sit with it. "Fine," she said. He wrapped her ankle with a strip of clean cloth from a supply he kept for exactly such purposes, bound it firmly and with evident knowledge of how an injury ought to be bound, and said, "Keep it elevated tonight." He brought her supper to the chair. She started to object, and he set the plate in her hands with a look that suggested he would simply wait until she stopped objecting. And she took the plate and ate. And she did not say thank you because somehow thank you seemed too small and too formal for what was being given and received in that cabin. She said instead, "Tell me about the painting, the flowers." He sat in the opposite chair and looked at the watercolor on the wall. "I found a valley in my first summer on this range," he said. "It was full of columbines. I had never seen anything like it, the whole floor of the valley blue and white." He paused. "I cannot carry the valley with me, but I can paint what I remember." "Where did you learn to paint?" she asked. "My mother taught me," he said. She believed that a man ought to cultivate beauty alongside everything else. She was a practical woman who also had a piano in the parlor and wildflowers on the table every week from May to October. Said this simply, without sentimentality, though she could hear the regard in his voice clearly. "She sounds remarkable," Sarah said. "She was," he said. "She died 4 years ago, fever." "I am sorry," Sarah said, and she meant it with the particular weight of someone who had also lost people to fever and knew what that cost was. "My father died 2 years before that," he continued. "He was a farmer in Virginia, good man, worked himself to a standstill and died in his sleep one March morning." He looked at the fire. "I came west after that, seemed like the right direction." "Do you have siblings?" she asked. "One sister," he said, "married to a schoolteacher in Richmond. She writes me letters every few months. I write back when the mail writer comes through." Sarah thought of her brother Thomas and the watch in her tin box. "I had a brother," she said. "He died of fever 3 years ago. He was 22. Levi looked at her, and the look was not pity, which she could not have endured, but a simple acknowledgment of loss offered from someone who understood what loss was. "What was his name?" he asked. "Thomas," she said. "He was funny. He could make anyone laugh. He was going to be a doctor." She had not spoken Thomas's name aloud to anyone in over a year, and the saying of it felt both painful and necessary, like setting down something she had been carrying too long in one arm. "He sounds like someone worth missing," Levi said. Yes, she said. He was. They sat with that for a while in the comfortable silence that had developed between them, the fire crackling, the wind working at the cabin walls with the dedicated persistence of a Colorado winter, and Sarah Boone sat in the lamplight with her wrapped ankle elevated and felt, for the first time in a very long time, less alone. The days continued to accumulate like the snow outside, each one building on the last into something that had its own particular architecture. Sarah's ankle healed in 5 days, during which time Levi fetched water and said nothing about fetching water. When she resumed her daily trips to the creek, she did so without comment, and he did so without comment, and somehow the whole thing had been resolved without either of them making it into a thing to be resolved. They established a rhythm of the days that felt natural in the way that things felt natural when they had been arrived at honestly rather than negotiated. She cooked breakfast because she was an earlier riser, and he was already out checking traps. He cooked supper because it was dark by the time he was back from the far end of the line, and she had been working on whatever needed doing in the cabin, and they were both tired, and he cooked well, and she was learning from watching him how he managed the limited ingredients they had to make them interesting, which she observed with the focused attention she brought to any skill worth having. She read his Thoreau and then his copy of Robinson Crusoe, and then, because she had finished both of those, she read the Trapper's Almanac he had from the previous year, which was actually more interesting than Robinson Crusoe in her opinion, because it contained real information about real conditions, and she had always found real things more engaging than invented ones. She told him this over supper one evening, and he laughed, which was not something he did often and which had, she had come to understand, the quality of something genuinely earned. His laugh was low and brief and real, not the social laugh that most men deployed, but the actual one that happened when something struck him as genuinely amusing. "You are the only person I have ever met who preferred the almanac to Defoe," he said. "Crusoe's problems were largely of his own making," she said. "The almanac is describing conditions that simply are. I find conditions that simply are more useful to understand than problems someone made for themselves." He looked at her across the table with that expression that she had been cataloging without intending to, the one where the corners of his eyes softened slightly and his mouth had a quality of wanting to say something that he had decided not to say. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You were about to say something," she said. "I was thinking something," he said. "Not necessarily the same as being about to say it. What were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the direct simplicity that was, she was beginning to understand, the truest expression of who he was. "I was thinking that you are the most interesting person I have shared this cabin with." "How many people have you shared this cabin with?" she asked. "In 8 years, 3 men passing through, weather stopped like you. A family once 2 days heading to Denver." He looked at her steadily. "No one like you." She looked back at him. The fire was behind him, and the lamplight was between them and outside. The snow was falling again in its patient, relentless way, and Sarah Boone felt something she had been refusing to feel for weeks press forward against her chest from the inside like a hand against a door she had been holding closed. She stood up and carried her plate to the wash bowl and washed it, and then she said good night, and she lay in the bunk in the dark, and she listened to him settle near the fire, and she thought, with considerable clarity, that she was failing completely at needing no one. The problem with Levi Sawyer was not that he was overwhelming. The problem was precisely the opposite. He was quiet, and his quietness was not absence but presence, a steady warmth in the room like the fire, something that was simply there and that you had begun, without noticing the moment it happened, to depend on. He had not declared anything. He had not pressed anything. He had not looked at her in a way that was anything other than respectful and honest. And yet somehow, in the course of the weeks since the storm had stranded her here, she had come to know him in a way that she had never known most people she had spent years with. She knew that he rose before light because he was most himself in the early morning hours when the world was quiet. She knew that he had been to school until he was 15 and had educated himself after that, and that he had a precise and unusual mind that moved carefully but arrived at correct conclusions. She knew that he talked more at night than in the day, when the work was done and the fire was built up, and there was nothing required of either of them. She knew that he was careful with living things, returning trapped animals that had no commercial value, the ones he had not intended to catch, with a pragmatic mercy that did not require comment because it simply was what he did. She knew that he was lonely, though she could not have said how she knew it because he did not say so and did not seem to experience it as a wound. It was more like a quality of the landscape itself, the same way the mountain was solitary not as a failing but as a fact of its nature. She recognized it because she had the same quality, and she recognized it in him in the way you recognize something you had always known was there but had not seen clearly before. It was the second week of November when the first real test of the winter came, and it was not the weather. Levi had been checking his traps and had gone to the far end of his line, which took him until nearly dark on a long day, and Sarah was at the cabin alone when she heard horses on the road below, too many horses moving too fast for weather travel. She went to the window and looked down through the spruce and could make out 3 riders moving north on the snow-packed road, pushing their horses hard. They did not stop. They did not look toward the cabin. They passed and were gone in the white afternoon. Levi came home an hour later and she told him what she had seen, describing the riders and their horses and their pace and direction with the detail she had taken the trouble to observe. He listened without interrupting, and when she had finished he said, 3 men on fast horses in this country in November either means they are running from something or running to something, and in either case they are desperate. I will check the cabin on the Hutchinson claim tomorrow, make sure old Charlie is all right. He looked at her steadily. You should keep your rifle within arm's reach for the next few days. I always do, she said. I know, he said. I'm just saying it aloud so we are agreed. He checked the Hutchinson cabin the next day and came back to report that old Charlie Hutchinson was fine, stocked in for the winter with his 2 dogs and a healthy skepticism about anyone he had not met in the past decade, which Levi had regarded as sensible. The riders had passed through without stopping anywhere on the ridge that he could find evidence of. The incident closed, but something in the way he had said we are agreed lingered in her thinking, because it was such a simple thing and such an accurate one. They were agreed about things, she and Levi Sawyer, more things and more fundamental things than she had been agreed with most people she had chosen to have in her life. She thought about that a great deal in the evenings, and she found she could not talk herself out of it the way she could usually talk herself out of things. It was the last week of November, the day before the first real warming that suggested a brief window of clear weather might be coming, when she came in from the Linta where she had been brushing congressmen and found Levi at the table with paper and a pen, writing something. He looked up when she came in and then back at what he was writing, and when she hung her coat and came close enough to the table to see, she saw that he was adding to the watercolor painting, working on a second smaller one at the corner of the same piece of paper, sketching out what appeared to be a figure in the landscape. She looked at it. The figure was a woman, tall and straight-spined, standing at the edge of a frozen creek in the snow, and she was looking at something in the middle distance with an expression of considering intelligence that Sarah recognized as one she wore without knowing she wore it. She stood very still. "That is me," she said. "Yes," he said. He set down the pen and looked at the sketch with a critical detachment. "The proportions of the coat are wrong. I cannot get the shoulders right." She sat down across from him slowly, and she looked at the sketch of herself on paper in his careful hand, standing in his winter landscape, and something in her chest moved in a way that was too large and too honest to be argued with any more. "Levi," she said. He looked up at her, and his dark eyes were quiet and steady and entirely present. "Why are you doing that?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone who did not know the answer, but in the way of someone who was taking care to say the true thing rather than the convenient one. "Because I want to remember you as you are," he said, "standing in the snow, looking at the world like you are working out exactly what it owes you and exactly what you owe it." Sarah looked at him, and the thing that had been pressing against the door inside her chest pressed once more, and this time she opened the door. "I told myself I needed no one," she said. "When I got to Colorado, when the homestead failed, I told myself the only person I could rely on was myself, and that was sufficient." "That kept you alive," he said without judgment. "It kept me alive," she agreed. "But I have been in this cabin with you for 5 weeks, and I know the difference now between alive and something more than that." She stopped because she was not accustomed to saying things this precisely true about herself, and the precision of it was slightly terrifying. "You have been proving me wrong about needing no one," very quietly, "all autumn." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open and unguarded, the stillness still present but something moving beneath it now. "I have not been trying to prove you wrong," he said. "I have just been trying to be useful to someone worth being useful to." She looked at the sketch of herself on his paper, standing at the frozen creek. She looked at the first painting, the columbines he could not carry with him but could remember in paint. She looked at this man across the table from her, who had given her his bunk without being asked and fixed her rifle without making it a gesture, and accepted her judgment without bruising his own, and laughed genuinely when she said something genuinely funny, and she thought that there were different ways to be strong, and that she had spent 6 years understanding only one of them. "I do not know what to do with you," she said honestly. The corner of his mouth moved. "You do not have to do anything with me," he said. "You just have to stop telling yourself you need no one because it is not true and you know it is not true." She breathed in slowly and breathed out. "It is not true," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and his hand was large and warm and completely steady, and she turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire building warmth behind him, and the lamp between them, and the winter doing its patient work outside. And Sarah Boone felt the particular sensation of arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time. December came in with a week of stunning clear cold, the sky above the mountains so intensely blue it looked painted by someone showing off, and the snow on the slopes blazing white in the low winter sun. Levi rigged a second pair of snowshoes for Sarah from the spare materials in the lean-to, working on them over the course of 2 evenings without announcing what he was doing, and on the third morning of clear weather he set them by the door and said, "I am going to check the east end of the line today. The view from the ridge is worth seeing if you want to come." She wanted to come. They went out together into the brilliant cold, moving through the spruce forest on the packed snow, their breath rising in white plumes, the world made entirely new and entirely quiet by the layer of white that covered everything. Levi moved through the forest with a long, easy stride that she matched without difficulty, because she was strong and had always been a fast walker, and because he was the kind of man who did not slow down for someone he respected. He checked the traps on the east line, extracting 2 marten and resetting the traps with a quick expertise, and then he led her up the slope to the ridge. The view from the ridge was, as he had promised, worth seeing. The mountains fell away in layers to the south and west, white and gray and blue-shadowed, an enormity of landscape that put human concerns in their correct proportion, and made the silence feel vast and ancient and clean. Sarah stood on the ridge in the December cold and looked out at it, and she understood something she had not been able to articulate before about why a man might choose this life, this solitary life on the mountain with the trapping and the careful provisions and the watercolor paintings of what he could not carry with him. She understood that it was not loneliness in the painful sense. It was a deliberate arrangement with the world, a chosen simplicity. She understood that she had done something similar herself, stripped her life down to what she could carry and what she could manage alone, and that the two of them were, in this particular sense, the same kind of person. "What will you do in the spring?" Levi asked beside her, looking out at the same view. "Find land," she said. "I still need to get to Denver, my cousin's claim." "There is good land on this range," he said. "The valley below the East Ridge would support a small farm, water access from the creek. Southern exposure, good soil under the snow." She looked at him carefully. He was looking at the view, not at her, but his jaw had a quality of intention in it. "Are you suggesting something?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was being precise. Then he turned and looked at her directly, his dark eyes steady and warm in the cold air, his broad shoulders filling the coat, the wind moving his hair at his jaw. "I am suggesting that Denver is not the only possible destination," he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose it is not." They walked back to the cabin together, and when they got inside and hung up their coats and she moved to put the kettle on the fire, he came and stood close behind her and put both hands gently on her shoulders, and she turned around and looked up at him in the firelight, and he kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything else: direct, genuine, careful, warm, and entirely worth having. She kissed him back, and it was not a small thing. They talked that night until very late, sitting close together at the fire, the kind of talking that happens when two people are arriving at something large and want to get there properly. She told him about the homestead and the drought and the bank, and the way she had felt when she had loaded her wagon, like someone who had been proven correct about the cruelty of the world. He told her about his years on the range, the first winter he had thought he was going to die in a storm, the things he had learned about patience and about the mountain's own timetable. He told her that he had tried to go back east once, 4 years ago, and had gotten as far as Richmond to visit his sister, and had found that he could not stay, that the life there felt constructed in a way that this life did not, that he had come back to Colorado feeling like himself for the first time in months. She told him about Thomas, about how Thomas had believed in her in a way that had made everything seem possible, and about how his death had taken something of that belief away, and about how she had compensated for its absence by becoming harder and more certain of her self-sufficiency. She told him this not to explain herself, but because he would understand it, and because she wanted him to know it. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention he had that was different from the ordinary kind, total and unhurried, as though whatever she was saying was the most important thing currently happening in the world. When she had finished, he said, "Thomas was right about you." She looked at the fire for a long moment, and then she said, "I think you might be right about the valley." He looked at her, and his expression was everything she had been learning to read in him over the past weeks, the warmth and the certainty and the quality of someone who had arrived at something they had not expected to find and were taking very careful note of it. "Is that so?" he said. "I would need to know about the soil," she said, "and the water rights, and whether there is a proper road access or just the ridge trail." "There is a road," he said, "and the water rights are unclaimed. I checked 2 years ago when I was thinking about it." "You were thinking about farming the valley." "I was thinking about the valley," he said, "thinking about it differently now." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was solid and warm and exactly the right height, and she looked at the fire and she thought that this was what it felt like to arrive somewhere, the particular rightness of a place you had not known you were heading to. The winter deepened through December and into January, and Sarah Boone and Levi Sawyer moved through it together with the particular ease of two people who had arrived at honesty about themselves and each other, and had found the ground solid. They were not without their moments of friction, because she was stubborn and opinionated about certain things, and so was he, though his stubbornness expressed itself differently than hers, quietly, and by simply continuing to do what he had decided was right, until she had either decided he was right too or persuaded him otherwise with facts. There was the argument about the ventilation of the lean-to, which she thought needed modification to prevent the dampness that was affecting Congressman's coat, and which she turned out to be correct about. There was the argument about the rationing schedule she had revised, specifically about whether they could afford to increase the grain supply for the horses given the storm projections, which he turned out to be correct about. They had these arguments with a straightforwardness that was deeply satisfying to both of them, because both of them were the kind of people who found it enormously irritating to disagree with someone who would not simply state their reasoning, and both of them stated their reasoning fully. She taught him the rationing calculations she had developed from her years of farm management, and he showed her the trapline mathematics he used to balance his commercial takes with sustainable population management, because he trapped on a principle of long-term viability and not short-term extraction, and she found this approach deeply logical and compelling. She showed him how to adjust the baking for altitude, which she had worked out through trial and significant error during her time in Pueblo, and which resulted in cornbread that did not collapse in the center. He showed her how to read the snow on the slopes for avalanche risk, and how to identify the patterns in the cloud formations that the mountains made and what they predicted for the following day's weather, which was more reliable than any almanac and more detailed. In January, a male rider made it through on the South Road, which was briefly passable after a few days of sun and warmer temperatures, and Levi sent a letter to his sister in Richmond. He let Sarah read it before he sealed it, not because he asked her to read it, but because he left it on the table and went to check the lean-to, and she read it, and then she sat with it for a long time afterward. The letter was plain and warm, describing the winter on the range and the trapping season and the provisions, and near the end it said, "I have someone here with me this winter, a woman named Sarah Boone who was caught by the storm in October. She is the most capable and honest person I have met since mother, and I am thinking about the spring differently than I have thought about it before." She folded the letter back carefully and set it where she had found it, and when he came back in she was stirring the supper pot and her back was to him, and she said, without turning around, "Your sister sounds like she will have questions." There was a pause, and then he said, "She has always had questions." Sarah turned and looked at him, and his expression was entirely open and unhurried, and she said, "That was a good letter," he said. "It was a true letter." The male rider had also brought a letter for Sarah, which she had not expected because no one knew she was here. But it turned out her cousin in Denver had sent letters along the South Road to the few winterstay addresses he knew on the off chance someone had seen her, because he had been expecting her since October and had grown concerned. The letter was brief and practical, asking if she was alive and if so where, and she wrote back and told him she was alive and at Levi Sawyer's cabin on the North Ridge, and that she would be coming in the spring with an altered plan about the Denver land. The male rider took both letters south with him, and the cabin seemed, after he left, a more connected place than it had been before, threaded into the larger world even through the snow. February on the mountain was a different kind of winter than January had been. In January, the cold was simply cold, a fact to be managed and prepared for. In February, it was personal, pressing in at every gap and testing every seal, and the wind came down from the north in long, cold runs that shook the cabin and drove the snow horizontal. They stayed close to the fire in the evenings, and the evenings became longer and more complete, the conversation between them growing in the way that conversation between people grows when they have already covered the practical ground and are moving into the territory that is simply about who you are. He told her about the first animal he had trapped when he was 12 years old, and how he had carried it home and felt the weight of having taken a life for the first time, and how his father had sat with him that evening and talked about the responsibility of it. He said that anything you take from the world, you owe back something, Levi said. Work, care, attention. He was talking about the land, but I think he meant everything. Sarah looked at him in the firelight. "I think he was right," she said. "I think that is what I got wrong about self-sufficiency. I was trying to owe nothing to anyone, to need nothing from anyone, and I think I was trying to make sure I could never be disappointed again. But not owing anything and not needing anything is not strength, it is just hiding." He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued carefully, the open, warm, certain one. "You were not hiding," he said. "You were surviving. There is a difference." "Was I?" she said. "When you were out in that snow with your mule refusing to walk," he said, "you were not hiding from the cold, you were standing in it." He paused. "You accepted help eventually." "Barely," she said. "Barely counts," he said. "You were not going to die before you accepted help. You had too much sense." She laughed, and it came out louder than she intended, and he smiled at her, and the fire cracked and popped and the wind went on outside, and she felt the enormous ordinary warmth of being known by someone, and knowing them in return. In the third week of February, the warmth between them completed its natural progression in the way that warmth between two honest people in a small warm cabin in the middle of a long winter tends to complete itself. She was sitting with her back against the bunk, reading the almanac for the second time through and making notes in the margins, and he was across the room at the table with the watercolor, working on a new painting, and she looked up from the almanac and watched him without him knowing she was watching, the careful movement of his hand, the way his brow gathered when he was concentrating, the breadth of his shoulders in the lamplight. She set the almanac down. She stood up. She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at what he was painting, which was the view from the ridge, the mountains falling away in layers in the December blue. She put her hand on his shoulder and he went still, and then he set down the brush and he turned and looked at her, and she said, quietly and plainly, "I am done pretending I need no one, Levi." He stood up from the chair, and he was very tall and very warm and very present, and he took her face in his hands with that careful gentleness, and he looked at her for a moment, dark eyes steady and warm, and then he said, "Good," and kissed her with an intensity that was nothing like the first time and was everything like someone arriving. What happened that night was the honest conclusion of everything that had been building since October, and it was nothing less than what it should have been, which was the two most self-sufficient people on a Colorado mountain range discovering that being together was, in every possible sense, better than being alone. March came in with its particular Colorado personality, which was to say it was entirely unpredictable. A warm day followed by a heavy snow followed by 3 days of brilliant sun, and then a cold snap that reminded you it was still March, and to adjust your expectations accordingly. The mountain showed its spring reluctantly, in small increments, the south-facing slopes beginning to show dark patches of bare ground, while the north faces remained deeply buried, the creek running higher and faster beneath its ice, the aspens developing the faint blush at their tips that meant they were considering leaves. Levi and Sarah spent March mapping the valley. On the clear days, they went out together on the snowshoes and walked the valley floor, which was beginning to be visible in sections where the snow had compressed and settled, and Levi drove stakes at the corners of where a house might sit, and where the kitchen garden would have full sun, and where the root cellar could be dug into the slope. Sarah sketched layouts in the margins of the almanac with the practical architect's eye she had developed from years of managing farm spaces, calculating storage requirements and workflow and winter access and summer harvest timing. 2 rooms to start, she said one afternoon, standing in the center of the proposed house site with the wind in her hair and the late March sun on her face. A main room with a proper cooking fireplace, not a camp one, and a separate sleeping room because privacy matters for 2 people's sanity. She looked at him steadily. "We will need a proper barn eventually. The lean-to works for your trapline, but it will not work for farming stock." "I know how to build a barn," he said. "I helped build 3 in Virginia." "Of course you did," she said, not without warmth. He was grinning at her, the full grin she had learned to look for because it was rare and entirely unguarded. "You are planning our house," he said. "I am planning a house," she said, and then she felt the precise accuracy of his phrasing settle on her like sunlight, and she said, "Our house. Yes, I suppose I am." He walked the 4 steps between them and took her face in his hands as he had done in February and looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his most honest one, open and certain and warm. "Marry me," he said. It was not a question shaped as a question, but neither was it a command. It was a statement of intent and an invitation, which was, she had come to understand, the most genuine way he had of communicating things that mattered enormously. She looked at him in the March wind with the valley spread below them and the mountains rising above, and the life she had been building in her mind for 2 years, transformed entirely into something she had not planned and could not imagine improving. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He laughed, low and real, and she laughed with him, and he picked her up off the snow entirely, which, given that he was a very large man with a great deal of muscle, was not a significant challenge for him, and held her up in the thin mountain air. And she held onto his shoulders and looked down at him and thought that Thomas would have liked him very much. They were married in April of 1879 by the Reverend Cole of the Pinehurst settlement, which was the nearest town of any description, 12 miles south on the road that had reopened with the spring thaw. The ceremony was small and practical, which suited both of them, attended by the Reverend, his wife Martha, old Charlie Hutchinson from the neighboring claim who came down from the ridge for the occasion looking both pleased and somewhat surprised, and a woman named Dolores Vega who ran the general store in Pinehurst and who had, over the course of a brief acquaintance with Sarah in the weeks before the wedding, recognized in her a kindred practical spirit and taken it upon herself to ensure that the wedding supper was a proper one. Sarah wore her best dress, which was blue wool and not particularly wedding-like, but which she had pressed carefully, and which Levi looked at with the expression of someone seeing something exactly right. He wore his good shirt and his best trousers, and had trimmed his beard and worn his hair back with a strip of leather, and he looked, objectively, like a man who had been designed specifically to stand in front of a mountain reverend in April and mean every word of what he was saying. She meant every word, too. She said them looking straight at him with her chin up and her voice steady and her eyes clear, because she was Sarah Boone, and she did the important things with her full attention, and this was one of the most important things she had ever done. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife, and Levi kissed her with complete disregard for the assembled company, and Charlie Hutchinson applauded enthusiastically, and Dolores Vega set out the supper, and Sarah Boone became Sarah Sawyer on a warm April afternoon with the mountains green budding above the town. They built the house in the valley through April and May and into June. Levi hauled timber from the upper slopes and cut it with the efficiency of a man who had spent years felling and splitting wood, and Sarah squared the logs and packed the chinking with a technique she had learned from a book she'd borrowed from the Pinehurst Lending Library, which was actually just a collection at the back of Dolores Vega's store but served the same purpose. They worked on it every clear day, side by side, and it went up with the steadiness of work done by two strong people who knew what they were doing and were working towards something they both wanted. Charlie Hutchinson came down 3 times to help with the heavy work, the ridgepole, the roof framing, the stone chimney, and would accept no payment except supper and the pleasure of the company. Dolores Vega came out once, ostensibly to assess the progress, but actually, Sarah suspected, to satisfy a genuine curiosity about the kind of woman who would winter alone with a mountain man and end up building a house in a valley with him, and she appeared satisfied by what she found. The house stood complete by mid-June, 2 rooms with a proper cooking fireplace and a separate sleeping room, and it was solid and tight and right. They carried the watercolor paintings from the cabin and hung them on the new walls, the columbines, and the woman at the creek. Sarah looked at both of them on the new plaster and felt something settle in her that had been in motion for a very long time. Levi still ran his traplines in the fall and winter, because the income from the pelts was real and reliable and would fund the building of the barn and the purchase of stock for the farm. But they put in a kitchen garden that first summer, and Sarah put in 20 acres of hay on the southern flat using seed she had bought in Pinehurst, and a rented plow that she managed with the same focused competence she brought to everything. And by the end of the summer, they had a root cellar full of provisions and a barn half-built, and a life that was recognizably a life, and not just a strategy for surviving. In the evenings, Levi painted. He had expanded from the small watercolors to larger pieces, and he had begun painting the valley in its different seasons, the spring green and the summer gold, and the autumn red gold of the aspens. Sarah began writing letters to her cousin in Denver, and to Thomas's former teacher in Nebraska, who had once told her that Thomas had been the brightest student he had seen in 20 years, and she told them where she was and what she was building. And the letters came back with warmth and genuine interest that reconnected her to a network of people she had been, in her years of necessary self-sufficiency, gradually letting go. She wrote to Levi's sister in Richmond as well, introducing herself properly, and the letter she received in return was long and warm, and told her a great deal about who Levi had been before the mountains, which filled in pieces she had been curious about. They had their arguments and their differences, because they were real people and this was a real marriage, and neither of them had any patience for the kind of false accord that required someone to permanently diminish themselves. She fought him once, comprehensively and at considerable volume, about the management of the hay income, which she felt should be reinvested in the farm and which he felt should be partially held as winter reserve. And they argued for 2 entire evenings before arriving at a compromise that was actually better than either of their original positions, as was often the case. He told her afterward with a straight face that arguing with her was the most productive use of an argument he had ever experienced. She told him that she took that as the compliment it was obviously intended to be, and he laughed, and she laughed, and they went back to the pleasant work of building their life. By the fall of 1879, a full year after Sarah's wagon wheel had cracked on the mountain road and stranded her in a storm, the valley farm had taken its proper shape. The barn stood solid, housing 2 horses, congressmen, 4 dairy cows, and a population of chickens that Sarah had acquired from a farm family passing through Pinehurst on their way to California, and who had been willing to sell rather than transport them. Levi had built a proper woodshed attached to the north side of the house, and the kitchen garden had produced beyond what they needed for 2 people, and Sarah had taken the surplus to Dollar's Vegas store and sold it, which had been both profitable and the beginning of a real friendship with Dollar's that expanded over the following months into the kind of friendship that was rare and worth having. October came around again, and with it the particular quality of mountain light that Sarah would always associate with the year that had changed everything, the low gold afternoon light and the sharp smell of the air, and the aspens at their brief blazing best before the cold stripped them. Levi was out at the near end of his trapline, and Sarah was in the kitchen garden doing the final harvest of the root vegetables, before the hard frost that the sky was clearly promising within the week. And she was thinking about the letter she had received that morning from her cousin in Denver, who had found good land on the eastern plains and was doing well, and about the letter from Levi's sister, who was expecting a child in January and was cautiously hopeful. She was also thinking about the fact that she had been feeling differently for the past several weeks, a kind of fullness and tiredness and bodily change that she recognized from her years of watching other women recognize it in themselves, and that she had been sitting with quietly and with considerable private astonishment. She was still in the garden when Levi came back on the horse, and she looked up at him in the October light, her hands full of parsnips, and she said, "I need to tell you something." He was off the horse before she finished the sentence, crossing to her with the long strides he had, looking at her face with his particular focused attention. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am, in fact, expecting a child." He went very still. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something wide open and entirely new, the most unguarded his face had ever been. "Sarah," he said. "Sometime in April, I think," she said practically. which will be inconvenient for the spring planting, but we will manage the timing." He took the parsnips out of her hands and set them down on the ground, and then he pulled her against him and held her, not gently but with the full strength of those arms, and she leaned into it and held onto the front of his coat and felt him breathe. "April," he said into her hair. "Approximately," she said. He laughed against her hair, low and warm, and she smiled against his coat, and the October light came through the aspens in its golden way, and the mountains stood over the valley as they always had, patient and enormous and permanent. They wrote to Dolores Vega, and to Levi's sister, and to Sarah's cousin, and the letters that came back were warm and practical and full of advice, some solicited and some not. And Dolores Vega arrived in person 3 days later, ostensibly on other business, but actually to personally determine that Sarah was well, and to bring with her 2 wool blankets she had ordered from the East that were the finest quality Sarah had ever seen. The baby came in the 2nd week of April 1880, on a morning when the valley was just beginning to show its first green, and the mountains were still white above the tree line. He was a boy, sturdy and loud, with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and a completely unreasonable quantity of opinion about the world from his very first hour in it. They named him Thomas Levi Sawyer. Levi held him in the big rough hands that could skin a marten and lay a foundation stone and paint mountain wildflowers in watercolor, with the most careful tenderness Sarah had ever witnessed, looking down at this small face with an expression so completely at peace that it was almost a physical thing, something that filled the room. Sarah lay in the bed she had built alongside Levi in the house they had built together in the valley that he had shown her from the ridge, and she looked at her husband holding their son, and she thought about October of 1878, about the wagon wheel cracking on the mountain road, and the snow beginning to fall and the stubborn mule, and the rider coming out of the white curtain of the storm on his dark horse. She thought about standing in the snow and saying she was perfectly fine and needing no one, and about him sitting there on the horse without arguing or pitying or waiting for anything except her own honest recognition of what was true. She thought about 5 weeks of a winter that had been, without announcement or drama, the most significant 5 weeks of her life. The fire and the lamp and the almanac and the watercolor paintings, and the gradual, patient, entirely quiet dismantling of a certainty she had built as armor and mistaken for strength. She thought about the ridge in December and the view and the valley, and about kissing him in the firelight for the first time, and about March snow and a question that was an invitation, and about April and a reverend and a blue wool dress and Dolores Vega's supper. She thought about a year of building, hay fields and a barn and a root cellar and a friendship and a letter to a sister in Richmond, and about the October light through aspens and a man coming back from his trapline and her saying, "I need to tell you something." She thought that the woman in the watercolor painting, standing at the frozen creek, looking at the world like she was working out what it owed her, would not recognize this room, would not recognize this warmth, this sound of a baby, and the deep voice of a man speaking gently to him, this deliberate, ordinary abundance of a life shared with someone worth sharing it with. And then she thought that the woman in the painting was still her, exactly her, that nothing essential had been surrendered. She had not needed anyone to save her. She had needed someone to stand beside her, and she had been right to find the difference, and she had been right to let him in when she found it. Levi looked up from the baby and at her, and his dark eyes were warm and certain and entirely present. "Thomas Levi Sawyer," he said, in his deep, unhurried voice. "He looks entirely competent." "He looks like he is already planning something," Sarah said. "He gets that from his mother," Levi said. She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one she had been giving him more freely since October of 1878, and he smiled at her in the April morning light of the house in the valley. And the baby, Thomas Levi Sawyer, regarded the ceiling of the room he had been born in with what was already an identifiable expression of assessment and intent. The barn needed its doors rehung before summer, and the south field needed to be expanded if they were going to take on the second cutting of hay she had been planning. And Congressman had developed a mild lameness in his left foreleg that wanted monitoring. And Dolores Vega had suggested that if Sarah was going to keep selling surplus produce, she might as well formalize the arrangement with a proper account at the store. And Levi's sister had written that she had delivered a healthy girl in January and named her Alina, and was considering a visit west in the coming year when Alina was old enough to travel. There were letters to write and seeds to order and plans to make and work to do, the good ordinary accumulating work of a life in forward motion. But for now, in the April morning with the valley green below the windows and the mountains white above them, and Thomas Levi Sawyer small and whole and certain between his father's careful hands, Sarah Sawyer let herself simply be here, in this room, in this life, in this particular warm truth of having been proven entirely and wonderfully wrong. She had told the mountain man she needed no one. He had looked at her in the snow and on the ridge and across the supper table by lamplight, and in all the ordinary extraordinary days of a long winter, and he had quietly, with complete respect for her strength and complete refusal to let her hide behind it, shown her the difference between surviving alone and living, fully alongside someone who saw her clearly, and found her worth every patient, quiet winter mile of it. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in the best possible way, wrong in the way that opened rather than closed, that added rather than subtracted, that made her not less herself but more. The mountains outside the window were the same mountains they had always been, enormous and patient and permanent, keeping their own counsel about the smallness of human beings and the remarkable things those small human beings occasionally managed. The houses they built in valleys, and the children they named after lost brothers, and the watercolor paintings of flowers they could not carry but could remember. And the love they arrived at by being honest in a cabin in the snow until honesty was the only thing left, and it turned out to be enough. It turned out to be more than enough. It turned out to be everything.